It's a great pleasure to be back in the University of London. As you heard, I have a University of London past. It's very, very pleasant to be back in this room again, and my thanks to the Wordsworth Trust, not only for asking me to do this lecture, but indeed for doing me the honour of asking to chair the Trust after such a distinguished chair as Chris Smith. Wordsworth and Byron ended up on opposite sides politically, and from Byron's viewpoint, the political treachery, as he saw it, dominated his view of Wordsworth. From Wordsworth's side, Byron's behaviour around the separation from his wife seems to have been important, and Wordsworth indeed wrote to Scott, praising Scott's articles on the separation in the Champion. Had Byron known this, the vision of judgment might have been more to do with Wordsworth and rather less with Surrey, but he didn't. For Byron, he uses the word reverence of Wordsworth, and that's even after he's written on Wordsworth's poetry in English Bards and Scots Reviewers and reviewed the 1807 volume. Wordsworth was a bit more sceptical of Byron even from the beginning, and they were equally rude about each other, of course, later on, and more than a hint of jealousy, I think, Wordsworth to Byron, Byron to Wordsworth. They only met once formally at a rather tense evening in Samuel Rogers's, you may imagine. Oddly enough, the annual Byron lecture at Nottingham in 1998 was given by Jerry McGann, and his title was Byron and Wordsworth. And here I am 20 years later giving the annual Wordsworth lecture, but as I say, that way round, Wordsworth, I hope, and Byron. My core point in my lecture is not unrelated, in fact, to Jerry's, which of course I reread in advance of preparing this. He contrasts Wordsworth's assignations of blessings to a transhuman source, conceived as both full and perpetual, with Byron's blessings as human and individuated. My characterization would be that Wordsworth's attitude to nature is part of a prioritization of simplicity and transcendence, whereas Byron's interest in the city is part of his prioritization of complexity, the flow of time, and ambivalence. But clearly, Jerry's view and mine are not unrelated. We think perhaps of nature versus the city, or at least the natural versus the social. Wordsworth first, Byron second in these pairings. But the driving ideas are what for many years has been called substitute religion in Wordsworth's case, and life's infinite variety, almost a phenomenological secularism in Byron's. Where Wordsworth sees wholeness, precisely there Byron sees emptiness. Where Byron sees delight in the mundane, Wordsworth sees triviality. Now these are opening generalities, of course, and I will pick at them, but they are a useful map, I hope, at least for what follows. Let's start by looking at Wordsworth's St. Paul's. Pressed with conflicting thoughts of love and fear, I parted from thee, friend, and took my way through the great city, pacing with an eye downcast, ears sleeping, and feet masterless, that were sufficient guide unto themselves, and step by step went pensively. Now mark, not how my trouble was entirely hushed, that might not be, but how by sudden gift of imagination's holy power, my soul in her uneasiness received an anchor of stability. It chanced that while thus I was pacing, I raised up my heavy eyes and instantly beheld, saw at a glance in that familiar spot, a visionary scene. A length of street laid open in its morning quietness, deep, hollow, unobstructed, vacant, smooth, and white with winter's purest white, as fair, as fresh and spotless as he ever sheds on field or mountain. Moving form was none, save here and there a shadowy passenger, slow, shadowy, silent, dusky, and beyond and high above this winding length of street, this moveless and unpeopled avenue, pure, silent, solemn, beautiful, was seen the huge, majestic temple of St. Paul in awful sequestration, through a veil, through its own sacred veil of falling snow. The great city is first characterised by the mood of separation, typically trapped internally, ears sleeping, feet masterless. The moment of at least partial release is of course quasi-religious. Imagination's holy power, I raised up my heavy eyes, a visionary scene, transformed from a familiar spot, and of course the vision is itself religious. St. Paul's behind the veil, as if of the temple, revealed in a gradual dissolution of the physical, slow, shadowy, silent, dusky, beyond. All of this could be Shelley's summit of Mont Blanc, but is St. Paul's in the snow, pure, silent, solemn, beautiful. It's a stunningly well-crafted piece. Not even Byron could deny that, but he might have a go at the philosophic point. He would latch onto the vacant in the deep, hollow, unobstructed, vacant, smooth and white with winter's purest white. He would worry about the unpeopled avenue. He would worry about the silence in pure, silent, solemn, beautiful. Now in Prophecy of Dante, Byron could himself talk of silence as beautiful, but more typically would be the worry that this vision of transcendence is without specific moral content. We'll come back to his radical example of how noise, as opposed to silence, can be transformative later. But in St. Paul's then, architecture from Wordsworth's standpoint is turned into what you might call the religious natural. Snow, fields, woods. And upon Westminster Bridge, of course, the city is turned into a human being. There is a list of physical objects, ships, towers, domes, theatres and temples, but they are, as in St. Paul's, under some sort of dissolution, silent, bare, open unto the fields, unto the sky. I might just hang on to that word open. We'll come back to it again later, that sense of something in the physical world parting. And the sonnet, of course, builds to its prayer-like identification of the city with human life. Dear God, all that mighty heart is lying still. We might feel that stillness as peace. Byron might feel it related to the same escapism as St. Paul's silence. Jerry McGann quoted Byron's journal to Augusta at one point in his Nottingham lecture. Byron says, I stopped at Vevey 2 hours, walked to the church, view is superb. Within it, General Ludlow, the regicide's monument, black marble, Latin inscription, but simple. And then later on in the journal, I am a lover of nature, neither the music of the shepherd, the crashing of the avalanche, nor the torrent, the mountain, the glacier, the forest, nor the cloud enabled me to lose my own wretched identity in the majesty and the power and the glory around, above, and beneath me. And this makes the point that for Byron, lists of physical objects do not dissolve. Neither at Vevey, where they get that very specific. I stopped at Vevey for 2 hours. The statue was black marble. There was a lovely view. There was an inscription. It was in Latin. And then later on, that long list, Byron's sort of natural equivalent of the ships, towers, domes, theatres, and temples of Westminster. But here, the mountain, the torrent, the glacier, the forest, but they don't dissolve. Now, where Byron sees this as how it is, I was walking through nature on my tour of the Alps, but I still felt miserable. Sees that as how it is. Wordsworth would see this as a failure of imagination, with a capital I. Here, of course, in his account of his tour of Switzerland in 1816, Byron is, you might think, at his closest to Wordsworth. Not only in his natural subject, the beauty of the Alps, and of course this is in Childe Harold Canto 3, but in having been physicked in Wordsworth by Shelley. That was the phrase that Byron himself used. He said he was dosed with Wordsworth by Shelley. And the results of that dosing are pretty clear in Childe Harold Canto 3. But the contrast is even more extreme if we return to London and St Paul's for a moment, in that key to Byron's later poetic philosophy. So after that 1816 period when he's writing Childe Harold and Manfred and doing his tour of Switzerland, the letters on the Bowls controversy. And you remember this was the controversy about the standing of Pope, and that Byron took Pope's side in this controversy against his contemporary romantic peers. And here from the Bowls controversy. Art is not inferior to nature for poetical purposes. What makes a regiment of soldiers a more noble object of view than the same mass of mob? Their arms, their dresses, their banners, and the art and artificial symmetry of their position and movements. A Highlander's plaid, a Mussulman's turban, and a Roman toga are more poetical than the tattooed or untattooed New Sandwich savages, although they were described by William Wordsworth himself like the idiot in his glory. We are asked what makes the venerable towers of Westminster Abbey more poetical as objects than the tower for the manufacture of patent shot, surrounded by the same scenery. I will answer: the architecture. For Byron, it is human work and craft which make meaning. Wordsworth's insubstantial St Paul's has no place in this aesthetic, which is of course more than an aesthetic, it is a life view. We'll come back to the idiot boy later. Byron's defence of Pope in the letters is actually in one key way perverse, for it rests on art as the human creation of meaning and not art as a copy of a divinely ordered universe. So there is a way in which Pope is actually slightly closer to Wordsworth, although it's Byron here that's actually defending Pope, but he's defending Pope in a rather strange sort of way. Byron is certainly pitched against the high romantic idea of a pantheistic nature, its Neoplatonic essentialism, but its view of society, the city and art as a fortress against chaos is emphatically not Pope's view. Let us leave the city for a little, however, and probe the attack on the idiot boy. It's probably just a bit of Byronic fun at the easy and somewhat cheap expense of the word idiot, which he wants to transfer by association to the nature poets. But it's also quite consistent with his way of thinking. The structure of the poem The Idiot Boy is, in the best sense, simple. Boy at one with nature, produces love in mother. Love is more effective than the skill of doctor. Betty's mother love is transferred to Susan, who is cured. The idea of the holy fool as the font of transformative love is not, of course, new to Wordsworth, and it has a considerable history in the Romantic period, as far down the century, if you like, as Wagner's Parzival. But for the Byronically minded, Johnny's silence as he rides off, and you remember that specifically mentioned, he rides off silently, and Betty's terribly proud, and his misidentification of owl and moon in the last stanza are signs not of holy plenitude, but of worldly failure. Indeed, in its emptiness of moral choice, the idea of action being provoked by the holy fool is, from Byron's point of view, dangerous. For Wordsworth, of course, such a view, Byron's view, is reductionist, and in its turn, spiritually dangerous. And of course, Byron's choosing the idiot boy partly to make a debating point, as it were, of course, as I've suggested. And you don't have to look far in Wordsworth, obviously, to get examples of very specific moral choice and moral actions. I mean, you know, Rude Cottage, Goody Blake and Harry Gill. I mean, you know, almost anywhere you want to look. The reductionism of Byron's insistence on material fact and specific moral behaviour, the latter, of course, part of his defence of Pope's satiric mode. I mean, he's very keen on the detail of moral behaviour, and that's, of course, what fires the satiric project. The reductionism of Byron's insistence on material fact is linked in Wordsworth's worldview both to the material city and to the over-exercise of the Enlightenment's rational scepticism. So in that sense, Byron is very close to Pope, because it's an Enlightenment rational scepticism. Thus, in Tintern Abbey, amid the din of towns and cities, that blessed mood in which the burden of the mystery, in which the heavy, the weary weight of all this unintelligible world is lightened, not by any irritable reaching after fact and reason, as another poet would say, but by being laid asleep in the body amid the many shapes of joyless daylight. Laid asleep in the body amid the many shapes of joyless daylight. That use of daylight in this sense almost has a kind of pre-echo. I'm mentioning Wagner twice in this lecture for some reason or other. A pre-echo of Wagner's Tristan, although Wordsworth, of course, stopped short of invoking the night as preferable to the day, but there's something of that in there as well. And I'd like us to hold on to that phrase as well, amid the many shapes, because Byron is going to approve of the many, life's infinite variety, whereas Wordsworth, of course, maniness, the variety, is something of which he is deeply suspicious. And what is nature then, in contrast to the city and the wakefulness of the body? Tintern Abbey again. Once again, I sit here under this dark sycamore and view these plots of cottage ground, these orchard tufts, which at this season, with their unripe fruits, among the woods and copses lose themselves, nor with their green and simple hue disturb the wild green landscape. Once again I see these hedgerows, hardly hedgerows, little lines of sportive wood run wild, these pastoral farms, green to the very door. We note the reassuring recurrence, kind of circularity of time, and despite the initial specificity of the dark sycamore tree, the way in which the monochrome landscape dissolves into itself. Cottage ground lose themselves with their green and simple hue into the wild green landscape. Hedgerows, hardly hedgerows, little lines of sportive wood, pastoral forms, green to the very door. I happened to be reading Peter Matheson's The Snow Leopard the other day, and despite its Buddhist underpinning, was struck by how un-Wordsworthean his description is. This is just sheer chance and contingency, as it were. Here he is talking about the wood edge, alder and ilex, viburnum, barberry and rhododendron, daisies, and pale lavender asters, much like those that would be abundant now in woods and fields at home. The list of specificity there again: alder and ilex, viburnum, barberry, rhododendron, daisies. Wordsworth does give us the sycamore tree, but then he abandons that kind of specificity. And if you look through Wordsworth's descriptions, you'll find that same kind of contrast. They're not that kind of specified detail. Wordsworth indeed is deliberately sliding away from detail as his eyes are made quiet by the power of harmony. But of course, when we stop our reading of Tintern Abbey there, and a debating Byron might want us to stop it there in order to emphasise the difference, we misread the poem. Because the still sad music of humanity does not vanish in the sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused, but returns to Wordsworth's very real sister. The poem hands itself as a gift to Dorothy in real time, imagining a future which remembers this present moment. It is as if Wordsworth is heeding his own warning in lines left upon a yew tree: solitary contemplation has to turn towards human interaction. Would this satisfy his lordship? It might. The last 5 lines of Tintern Abbey are oddly resonant of the end of Childe Harold Canto 4, at least so they seem to me. Here is Tintern Abbey first. Nor wilt thou then forget that after many wanderings, many years of absence, these steep woods and lofty cliffs, and this green pastoral landscape were to me more dear, both for themselves and for thy sake. Byron. I have loved the ocean, and my joy of youthful sports was on thy breast to be borne, like thy bubble, onward. From a boy I wantoned with thy breakers, they to me were a delight, and if the freshing sea made them a terror, 'twas a pleasing fear, for I was as it were a child of thee, and trusted to thy billows far and near, and laid my hand upon thy mane, as I do here. And it's that sudden turning to the present moment. It's not only the memory of nature, which of course in a way is the same as Tintern Abbey. He's replaying how he was in his youth and what has changed. Wordsworth turns to Dorothy And Byron suddenly turns away from himself and his memory and touches the ocean. This reaching out in love sounds familiar in both senses, but in one poet it is a consequence of a failure underwritten by redemption, and in the other it is a failure that can only be partially underwritten by mundane effort. Okay, what exactly can I try and unpack that difference? What do I mean by that difference? Paula Majora Canamus is, of course, Wordsworth's epigraph to the Immortality Ode, "Let us sing of greater things." We will come back to Byron's last word and what he believes we should sing later. But there's a tree of many one. There's a tree of many one, a single field which I have looked upon. Both of them speak of something that is gone. The pansy at my feet doth the same tale repeat. Whither is fled the visionary gleam? Where is it now, the glory and the dream? The movement here is from the many to the individual. Single tree, the single field. These image the shades of the prison house of a city and rationality, closing the world down in one person's experience, cut off, isolated. Nothing can bring back the hour of splendour in the grass, of glory in the flower. Here is Byron also on ageing. No more, no more, oh, never more on me the freshness of the heart can fall like dew, which out of all the lovely things we see extracts emotions beautiful and new, hived in our bosoms like the bag of the bee. Think'st thou the honey with those objects grew? Alas, 'twas not in them, but in thy power to double even the sweetness of a flower. What is the difference? Both here are talking about what's happened to the beauty of flowers and what's been lost in aging. For Wordsworth, the failure of age, if you like, is failure of the imagination to reconnect with the glory that was and is there. Trailing clouds of glory do we come from God who is our home, and the thoughts that do often lie too deep for tears are those of returning, of course, to that home. For Byron, the clouds of glory come not from somewhere else. The failure is ours, not to reconnect with something out there but lost, but to produce ourselves the clouds of glory. Not in thy power to double even, but in thy power to double even the sweetness of a flower. Both poets write of a loss of imaginative energy, but for one, imagination as a channel to the real. For the other, it is, well, imagination. Or as Wallace Stevens would put it, a necessary fiction. From Manfred, from Byron onwards, the meaning of his life could only be in an individual's hands. One of the spirits who's pursuing Manfred near the end of the poem says, Can it be that thou art thus in love with life, the very life which made thee wretched? And Manfred effectively answers, yes, the mind which is immortal is its own origin of ill and end, and its own place and time. In thy power to double even the sweetness of a flower. For the later Byron, stories transform the banal. Triviality can even save lives. When the Count and Beppo are in danger of a duel over Laura's affections, you remember what happens in Byron's Beppo? Beppo goes off to sea, and Laura, his wife, takes up with a local count, and Beppo comes back disguised as a Turk. They bump into each other in the street, and there's a terrible denouement possible. Obviously, it could be a duel. In one of Byron's earlier poems, it would have been a duel. But here the Count says, "Oh no, don't. Let's create a fuss in the street, let's come inside. And he invites Beppo into Beppo's own house. They entered, and for coffee called, it came, a beverage for Turks and Christians both, although the way they make it's not the same. Now Laura, much recovered or less loath to speak, cries, Beppo, what's your pagan name? Bless me, your beard is of amazing growth. And how came you to keep away so long? Are you not sensible 'twas very wrong? And are you really truly now a Turk? With any other women did you wive? It's true they use their fingers for a fork. Well, that's the prettiest shawl as I'm alive. You'll give it me. They say you eat no pork. And how so many years did you contrive to bless me? Did I ever? No, I never saw a man growing so yellow. How's your liver? And it goes on for another couple of sentences. But this outburst of triviality stops the tragedy, as it were, in its tracks. And it's Beppo's and the narrator's stories which make up their lives. Beppo's friends, the more for his long absence, prized him, finding he'd wherewithal to make them gay with dinners, where he oft became the laugh of them for stories, but I don't believe the half of them. But ere his youth has suffered, his old age with wealth and talking made him some amends. Though Laura sometimes put him in a rage, I've heard the Count and he were always friends. My pen is at the bottom of a page, which being finished, here the story ends. 'Tis to be wished it had been sooner done, but stories somehow lengthen when begun. And of course, in that story he's talking about at the end, it's life he's obviously talking about. And in a very typical Byronic way, the end, the significance of the end is downplayed. Ends don't mean very much, it's just my pen's got to the bottom of the page, so I'll stop. Para majora canamus. Well, clearly that's not where we've been with Byron for the last few stanzas, or at least not in the way that Wordsworth would mean it. In the prelude near the end of Book 2, very famous passage this, we find, of course, synthesis over analysis, nature over the city, spiritual oneness over the bodily distinct. Nor should this perchance pass unrecorded, that I still had loved the exercise and produce of a toil than analytic industry to me more pleasing, and whose character I deem is more poetic, as resembling more creative agency. I was only then contented when with bliss ineffable I felt the sentiment of being spread o'er all that moves and all that seemeth still, o'er all that, lost beyond the reach of thought and human knowledge, to the human eye invisible, yet liveth to the heart, o'er all that leaps and runs and shouts and sings, or beats the gladsome air, o'er all that glides beneath the wave, yea, in the wave itself, and mighty depth of waters. Wonder not if high transport, great joy I felt, communing in this sort through earth and heaven with every form of creature, as it looked towards the uncreated with a countenance of adoration, with an eye of love. One song they sang, and it was audible, most audible, then when the fleshly ear, o'ercome by humblest prelude of that strain, forgot her functions and slept undisturbed. An odd kind of audibility, of course, the skeptic would say, and we return again to that notion of silence. One song they sang. This is not infinite variety, this is many shapes becoming one, and that song is audible, but audible when the ear is sleeping undisturbed. Byron, of course, I perch upon an humbler promontory amid life's infinite variety. One song, infinite variety. Perhaps the most dramatic contrast with which to end, again a very well-known passage, but I make no apology for reading well-known passages. half the fun of giving these lectures is being able to read these things. The moon stood naked in the heavens at height immense above my head, and on the shore I found myself of a huge sea of mist, which meek and silent rested at my feet. 100 hills their dusky backs upheaved all over this still ocean, and beyond, far, far beyond, the vapours shot themselves in headlands, tongues, promontory shapes, into the sea, the real sea, that seemed to dwindle and give up its majesty, usurped upon as far as sight could reach. Meanwhile, the moon looked down upon this show in single glory, and we stood, the mist touching our very feet, and from the shore at distance, not the third part of a mile, was a blue chasm, a fracture in the vapour, a deep and gloomy breathing space through which mounted the roar of waters, torrents, streams innumerable, roaring with one voice. The universal spectacle throughout was shaped with admiration and delight, grand in itself alone, but in that breach through which the homeless voice of waters rose, that dark, deep thoroughfare, had nature lodged the soul, the imagination of the whole. So again, physical world seems to split open, splits apart to reveal not the real physical sea, and he's played with that notion earlier on, the mist and then the real sea, the real sea underneath it. But this isn't that. It's not the real physical sea beneath the sea of mists, but the universal soul, the imagination of the whole. There's a strikingly different image of the ocean at the beginning of Canto 15 of Don Juan, where Byron says, more or less the whole of life's a syncope or a singultus, emblems of emotion, the grand antithesis to great ennui, wherewith we break our bubbles on the ocean, that watery outline of eternity, or miniature, as it is my notion, which ministers unto the soul's delight in seeing matters which are out of sight. Matters which are out of sight, and the implication, of course, is non-existent. Lost beyond the reach of thought, to the human eye invisible, becomes ministers unto the soul's delight in seeing matters which are out of sight. For Byron, the blue chasm is an emptiness. For Wordsworth, a wholeness. Where Byron sees stories, Wordsworth sees transient triviality. On the one hand, a religion for an individual age, clothed in Milton's verse. On the other, an insistence on human responsibility, wearing a borrowed cloak of Italian motley. Paula majora canamus. Another race hath been, and other palms are won, thanks to the human heart by which we live, thanks to its tenderness, its joys and fears. To me the meanest flower that blows can give thoughts that do often lie too deep for tears. Or Byron, what does he think we should sing? Second last stanza of Don Juan that he completed. I leave the thing a problem, like all things. The morning came, and breakfast, tea and toast, of which most men partake, but no one sings. Thank you.